of the United Methodist Church in Fulton, Maryland. I am Richard Ballou, a board member of WesleyNexus, and it is my privilege to welcome you to this afternoon's program in support of Evolution Weekend 2020, Patriarchy in Science, in Education, in the Church. Today's program was organized and presented by WesleyNexus in partnership with the Baltimore, Washington Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church and the Clergy Letter Project. So will you please join for our invocation by the Reverend Joy Jones.
Will you pray with me? Amazing God, the more we learn of your creation, the more we are filled with awe and wonder. You who transcend all we know, who created atoms and molecules, and gases that compressed into liquids and liquids that compressed into solids. In ways we do not understand, you brought into being the double helix, that dance of life which creates and builds across time and place. We are so amazed at the complexity of creation, from subatomic particles to massive galleries, from tiny microbes to giant redwoods and huge elephants. And the platypus. We can hardly comprehend how truly ancient your creation is, and we are stunned and made feeling our smallness by the enormity of life that came into being eons before we existed, much of which lies buried in rocks and sands of time. Thank you for your gifts of curiosity and analytic minds, and for our eagerness to explore what we do not understand. Oh God, may we always use our intelligence for good, caring for all of creation and not just that small part we call human. Teach us to see value in all that is, visible and invisible, majestic and humble, vast and infinitesimal. Let us know your presence among us as we hear words of wisdom, see the truth of our human condition, and proclaim our faith. May all that we discuss and share bring honor and glory to you through your Holy Spirit. And I offer this prayer in the name of our brother Jesus, who came into the world teaching us how to love. Amen.
Amen.
Do you want me to keep going? Because I'm supposed to do that next.
So I have a few more words to say.
Okay.
So a bit about WesleyNexus. WesleyNexus was chartered in the state of Maryland in 2009 by members within the Baltimore, Washington Annual Conference and the Virginia Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church, and is a 501c3 educational and charitable organization. WesleyNexus is dedicated to the dissemination of information about religious faith and science in the 21st century, with specific grounding in the Wesleyan tradition. Albert Einstein is attributed the statement that science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. And in the tradition of John Wesley, we believe that science and religion are best in partnership. WesleyNexus supports newsletters and a website, and the website is designed to provide resources to individuals and groups who are interested in science and religious faith, especially those who find themselves within the Wesleyan tradition. Visitors are encouraged to download these resources and to participate in a community dedicated to science and religion. It is now my privilege to introduce Maynard Moore, who is the president of WesleyNexus, who will say a few words and introduce our program today.
Am I not supposed to do this welcome? We're supposed to call Joy to do the welcoming to the annual conference.
Okay, well, we can do that. Joy, will you do that?
I learned a long time ago that making mistakes doesn't matter. Unless you're doing research and it makes your results unrepeatable, then you've got a problem. But I just wanted to say welcome to all of you who are here at the conference center today, and those who have tuned in from this program, from wherever you happen to be, which I hope is sunny and warm, or else you have a lot of snow for skiing. Either one would be fine with me. I greet you on behalf of our resident bishop, Bishop Latrell Easterling, who cannot be here today. She is wrapping up a weekend with 4,000 youth and their chaperones at our annual youth event called ROCK, which is on the other side of the Chesapeake Bay. Bishop Easterling was a prominent part of this program in 2017, and she asked us to share her greetings with you. I also welcome you on behalf of the entire cabinet and conference staff, who are also with Bishop Easterling and 4,000 youth, and they hope to get back before the Bay Bridge becomes a standstill with all of the cars. The Baltimore-Washington Conference of the United Methodist Church is made up of 632 congregations, 4 very active campus ministries, 3 retreat and camping ministries, and lots of historic sites in the Mid-Atlantic region. If you are interested in the history of Methodism in America, this is the place to be. Our ministry jurisdiction includes all of Washington, D.C., most of the state of Maryland, with a few exceptions. We don't get to go to the Eastern Shore, for example. 2 counties in the panhandle of West Virginia and the Church of Bermuda. The conference has more than 1,000 ordained clergy under the supervision of Bishop Easterling and her 8 superintendents. The conference meets annually in May with clergy and lay members acting together to develop our common ministry. The makeup of our annual conference is highly diverse, with people of many ethnic backgrounds, ages, geography, social situations, and firmly held opinions. Every 4 years, the annual conference elects delegates to the United Methodist General Conference, which is the church body that makes decisions for the global United Methodist Church. The General Conference will be meeting this year in May. United Methodists enjoy a long tradition of community activism guided by our social principles that were first articulated in 1910, and a side note, were adopted by the National Council of Churches as a model for all Christians in America. They have been revised, updated, and become more inclusive in the ensuing decades. Our social principles give us a distinct identity within Protestantism and define a stance that guides us on almost every aspect of church and society. And here is what our social principles have to say about science in the most recent book of discipline. We recognize science as a legitimate interpretation of God's natural world. We affirm the validity of the claims of science in describing the natural world and in determining what is scientific. We preclude science from making authoritative claims about theological issues, and theology from making authoritative claims about scientific issues. We find that science's description of cosmological, geological, and biological evolution are not in conflict with theology. We find that as science expands human understanding of the natural world, our understanding of the mysteries of God's creation and word are enhanced. We also believe that theological understandings of human experience are crucial to a full understanding of the place of humanity in the universe. Science and theology are complementary rather than mutually incompatible. We therefore encourage dialogue between the scientific and theological communities and seek the kind of participation that will enable humanity to sustain life on earth and, by God's grace, increase the quality of our common lives together. May that be so. And so it is in this day and in this spirit that we affirm the mission of WesleyNexus and look forward to our awesome presentations that I know are just going to be really super cool. I'm not supposed to say things like that, but I do. Thank you.
No, we appreciate your being able to make statements like that, Joy. That's why we invited you. So it's my task to simply recognize and give grateful appreciation to our co-sponsors. The first is the Clergy Letter Project. And some of you know this is an endeavor designed to demonstrate that religion and science can be compatible and to elevate the quality of the debate on science and religion. This is the 15th anniversary of Evolution Weekend, which was initiated and organized by Michael Zimmerman. Michael, we know you're out there on the West Coast, and we just want to give you our appreciation for your support. This is the 7th time that WesleyNexus has helped sponsor the Evolution Weekend program in Maryland. And we do want to encourage you to access the email that will directly allow you to ask questions of our speakers once we get to that point. It's Evolution Weekend MD for Maryland, Evolution Weekend MD at gmail.com. And I'm not sure, Brad, if you can have that flash on the screen occasionally as we go about the business today. But that would be helpful as a reminder to people. And in this case, we want to recognize that there are now 6 distinct clergy letters that have been initiated by Michael Zimmerman and and those who participate across the world are occasionally requested to make suggestions for additional clergy letter statements. And some months ago, those of us who are in the Clergy Letter Network were asked, do you believe that we have reached a point with a climate crisis that we should initiate a clergy letter on the climate crisis? And overwhelmingly, the responses were positive, and so a climate crisis letter has been initiated. 386 signatures already are recorded on this, and what we want to do is encourage every one of you today, when you go back to your computers tonight or tomorrow morning, log into the Clergy Letter Project and go down and find the climate crisis letter and add your name and church affiliation if you have one, however you want to identify yourself, but sign on to the climate crisis letter. You don't have to be a clergy person to do this, but we want to see some 500 signatures on this within the next 30 days, and as that will grow in the months ahead, we'll see people around the world signing that letter. So don't forget that. It's in your handout, and it's part of the presentation that we're making today. Let's see, how can I advance this? This one? This one? All right. These are some of the resolutions that have been passed within the constituencies of United Methodist Church. The 2016 Book of Resolutions has this statement on God's creation and the church. I won't read that, but you can You can see the highlight there, and it was referenced by Joy a few minutes ago. There's two specific resolutions that have been passed in the Baltimore-Washington Conference. The first in 2011 was affirming the importance of the dialogue among people of our churches in the field where religion meets science. And we encourage persons who are so inclined to utilize the resources available on the WesleyNexus.org website for discussion purposes. Our purpose is to resource the churches and the people who want to engage in this dialogue. And then in 2013, WesleyNexus presented another resolution which was passed. This was pretty much authored by retired clergy person Henry Schwartzman, who's one of our consistent and most generous donors. Thank you, Henry, for all your support. But this resolution says, as a church that talks and grapples with wanting to grow and reach out to young adults who find themselves leaving us, not wanting to be part of the church because of archaic thinking in the church, and two, wanting to be vital and relevant to congregations, let us take the time now to make the commitment to the great mystery of our evolving life, to make our over 600 plus churches open to the God of evolution, who is wooing us to change our language and to do the necessary rethinking and teaching that would relate evolutionary science to evolving religious and spiritual understanding in a holistic way. Now, of course, it's not possible to measure how many of our clergy persons and leaders in the church take this seriously, but it did pass the annual conference that year, and we're on record as affirming this, the importance of this dialogue and the teaching and preaching of the church. Now, Henry referenced in that particular resolution the fact that young people are leaving our churches. Our young people remain with us and are important in our congregations as long as they are at home. They go off to college or they begin to work and begin to fall away. That's because we do a very poor job of educating them as to what they will encounter in the real world. So WesleyNexus is pleased to have a program that is some 4 or 5 years old now, and I want to introduce Jennifer Secchi Shields, who's the director of that program. It's called Discovery in Faith, and it is generating a life of its own as we move forward in these times. Jennifer.
Thank you, Maynard. Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Secchi Shields, and as Maynard said, I'm the founder and director of one of WesleyNexus's initiatives, Discovery in Faith. And Discovery in Faith is particularly concerned with how the dialogue between science and Christian faith bears on our ability to nurture the Christian faith in the lives of the next generation. Studies tell us that after the age of 15, 60% of our young people will leave the faith and the church. I want that number to sink in for a moment, 60%. These are the children we've baptized, taken to Sunday school, worshiped with, went to choir, went on youth mission trips, and yet 60% are falling away. And what those studies tell us is that we know that among the top reasons, 2 of the top reasons have to do with perceptions of conflict between science and faith. We live in a world that has been and is increasingly shaped by science and technology, and we're not doing a good job of helping young people understand how all of those puzzle pieces fit together into a coherent whole. And so they have perceptions of conflict. The next number I want you to remember is 11. We know that by the age of 11, children worldwide are already developing these perceptions of conflict. So the work of discovery and faith is about a better way, a third and better way, actively helping the next generation understand and experience the harmony between science and faith, starting as early as age 3. So our work is with Christian pastors, educators, and parents to help equip them for this mission. And we do training workshops, customized church consultations, and develop children's resources, all for use within the church, within your already existing programming and with your already existing budgets. So I encourage you to check us out at discoveryandfaith.org or to follow us on Facebook. We're here to be in ministry with you, and together, this is a very solvable problem. And Discovery and Faith is here to help you solve it in your ministry setting. Thank you.
Yeah, you'll be surprised at what you'll find on Discovery and Faith website, and that it continues to build. So, Mike Beadler, where are you? Come on up for a word about this program that is going to be taking place in March, and WesleyNexus is pleased to be a co-sponsor for this. Come on.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Beidler. I'm the Washington, D.C. chapter president of the American Scientific Affiliation, the ASA. It's a network of Christians in the Sciences, international, that was founded in 1941, of all places out of Moody Bible Institute. But it has expanded quite a bit over the last 75 plus years, and we have a very active chapter here in the DC area. And on March 20th, and there are flyers outside on the registration table for a talk that's coming up on Friday, March 20th from 7 to 9 p.m. That's going to be at National Presbyterian Church, the northwest quadrant of DC. And our speaker is Dr. Michael Summers. He's the professor of planetary science and astronomy at George Mason University. Fantastic scientist, fantastic speaker, and he has a new book that just came out last fall called Imagined Life, a speculative scientific journey among the exoplanets in search of intelligent aliens, ice creatures, and supergravity animals. And again, this is a speculative journey, but it's based on science. It's based on the natural laws that we've discovered, and using that as a basis, it's a great imaginative trip into what we could find on the thousands of exoplanets that Michael Summers and other planetologists have found over the last 25 plus years. And, just to give you a hint of what Michael's done, he specializes in the study of structure and evolution of planetary atmospheres. Planetary research has dealt with the chemistry and thermal structures of atmospheres on Io, one of the Galilean moons of Jupiter, Titan, largest of Saturn's moons, Neptune, Triton, that's a Neptunian moon, Pluto, and Mars. And most recently, he was a leader in the New Horizons mission to Pluto and then beyond to the Kuiper Belt. So it's going to be a fantastic talk, and we want to encourage you to attend and tell all your family and friends to come join us. And that, again, that's going to be on March 20th, Friday evening from 7 to 10. We'll give you a little time to get home from work and get something to eat, but we'll have some light refreshments. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to come up to me after the
location?
National Presbyterian Church in D.C. So, thank you.
So all the information that you need on that is out on the registration table at the entrance when you came in. There are several other programs in the works. In April, WesleyNexus hopes to sponsor a presentation, maybe even 2 presentations by Nancy Abrams, who will be visiting the region from the West Coast. She's spoken on our behalf once before. She wrote the book, A God Who Could Be Real, and she will be here with her husband, astrophysicist, who also teaches at Santa Clara. More information will be coming in our newsletter on that. Also, we hope to have a program May 2nd, but this is before General Conference, the weekend before General Conference, with Catherine Keller from Drew University. We'll have more information on that in our newsletter as well. That will be at one of our major churches in Washington, D.C. Prominent theologian that I encourage you to pay attention to that. And in your booklet, you'll also see an announcement of the annual Star Island Conference this year on naturalism as religion, naturalism within religions, and naturalism without religion. This is a Star Island Conference, June 27th to July 4th, on Star Island off the coast of New Hampshire. Now, I mention this because as participants in WesleyNexus, you get a discount. So take this very seriously as an opportunity to engage in a week-long dialogue with scientists and other religious types from around the country, in fact, around the world. Usually there are representatives of about 6 or 8 different countries at that conference. It's a very stimulating conference. Now, let's begin our program, and let me introduce the moderator for our program today, Dr. Joy Jones. You've already heard from her with the invocation and the welcome into the Baltimore-Washington Conference. But Joy has been one of our most prominent ministers in the 20 years that she served the churches in our conference. She has a science background. She was trained as a scientist and worked as a scientist in immunology and microbiology. She spent time at the National Cancer Institute and has been involved in genetics as well. But she served our conference as in a number of capacities on the Board of Education, and most importantly as chair of the Board of Ordained Ministry, where she mentored numerous young pastors coming through the ordination process. So she's now active in North Bethesda United Methodist Church, and we welcome Joy to our program today, and she will moderate the program from here on out.
Thanks, Mayor. Okay. I don't know how to do that stuff. I just punch the button and it goes forward. Okay. They hadn't invented this stuff back when I was in science. So anyway, I'm delighted to be here. I think that Maynard asked me to moderate this program, and I'm not sure what a moderator does, but that's what I'm going to be doing. But I think I was asked because I have been and worked and lived in all 3 of the areas that we're talking about today. I've lived and worked in science, I've lived and worked in education, and I've lived and worked in the church. So I've been through it all. And I was commenting to our other panelists, when I was in graduate school, there were a total of 2 women in my class in graduate school. And I was asked why they should accept another girl into our program, because after all, I was only going to get married and not continue in research. It's not an unusual issue. I suspect that each of the speakers are going to give their own definition of patriarchy, but I think it's best thought of as one of the other isms that is out there. Maybe consciously aware of it, but I suspect for most people it is an unconscious bias. It is the bias, as the dictionary says, a system of society or government in which men hold power and women are largely excluded from it. Now, I will say this, some of my best friends are women. Are men, excuse me. They're women too. And my father was a man, so, there's a lot of good stuff out there. And I genuinely think that much of what we see, at least in my life, is unintentional. But I know for a fact it is intentional out there as well. We assume that the world operates a certain way. And remember, in taking a class on racism, the point was made that the people who hold the power are unaware of the people lower down and their issues, whereas the people lower down are very aware of the people who hold the power and what they can do with it. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, no matter what particular issue we are talking about. So I think it's very important for us to look at the assumptions that are made, the assumptions that underlie so many of our decisions that are made in society, in the church, in education. A commercial that's out there that just grates on my nerves every time I see it. It's about a woman who, they're announcing who's getting the promotion. And there's a woman who is running for it, and you can just see she's really nervous about it. And the promotion goes to the man, not to the woman. It's an advertisement for making your resume stronger. That's what it's about. But every time I see that, I feel this anger just welling up in me, because I suspect that the people who made that commercial never once thought about the implications that are in it. And it's that sort of stuff that goes on. So I'm going to stop talking and start introducing, if I can figure out. Are you up there, Amy? Yes, you are. Our first speaker today is Amy Swain Warffeli, who's going to talk with us about patriarchy in science. I discovered that she and I worked at different times in the same part of NIH. You can read her full background up there, but her background is structural biology. She's done research in a number of places, including NCI. She's been a scientific program administrator, and she now works at the Department of Energy supporting research. An active member of Grace United Methodist Church in Gaithersburg. Amy, you're up. And this thing is here. You probably know how to work this, right?
Just make sure here, thank you.
I think that's right.
There we go.
That sounds good.
All right. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Maynard, and thank you, Rick Barr, for inviting me to speak today. That's better. And thank you, WesleyNexus, for organizing this event. I'm here as a scientist who happens to be a woman, and I'm a United Methodist Church member. I'm not an authority on patriarchy in science, but I can share my perspective on it, which is informed by my own experiences as well as those of my colleagues, and by reading recently of current literature in the area. How appropriate for patriarchy to be the topic featured on Evolution Weekend. Evolution, a slow process of change towards something of greater complexity. Something better? The word patriarchy from the ancient Greek means rule of the father. It's a society in which males dominate, and it's a society of most world cultures. It's widely accepted that patriarchy is a sociological construct. And in my lifetime, it seems that I have witnessed society changing, gradually evolving into one in which patriarchy seems to be declining. Perhaps this is your observation? But there is no doubt that patriarchy does persist, and it brings with it several ugly concepts: gender stereotypes, sexual harassment and bias, sexism, inequality, and disparity. These realities disadvantage a whole group of people, women and girls, for a defining part of our identity. Patriarchy is evident in the society at large, and it's evident in science. Patriarchy itself is a complex concept and intersects with many other social forces. And science has many dimensions. There are numerous fields within science, just a few of which are listed here. For example, in the life sciences, 53% of scientists are women, which is equivalent to that in the general population. Whereas in the physical sciences, only 20 to 30% of the scientists are women. Across the various sectors in which science is conducted, I'm sure that there's a varying degree of patriarchy and that it's experienced in different ways. And there are a variety of career paths that one can choose in science, and so surely the expression of patriarchy, it varies among them. And it varies from one organization to the next, and is certainly dependent on the leadership within a lab or office environment. The point is that patriarchy in science is a very layered subject with many cross-influences and subtleties. So I hope in the short time that I have today in this talk to be able to share with you a taste of what I've been learning and reflecting on, with the caveat that there is such greater depth that is extensively covered in the literature. And at the end, I'll conclude with my own experience and my personal perspective. So let's move on to some history. Patriarchy in science naturally stems from patriarchy in society. And the early scientists were theologians and philosophers, necessarily males. These fathers of science, well-respected men, established the patriarchy that has persisted for centuries. A stark insertion in this litany of males is Marie Curie. She was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, the first person to win 2 Nobel Prizes, and the only person still to hold 2 Nobel Prizes in multiple fields. She received the prize for physics in 1903 and chemistry in 1911. So clearly, Marie Curie has advanced not only science, but women's place in the scientific community. Altogether, 19 women scientists have been recognized by the Nobel Committee for their contributions. And you can see that over the decades, the number of women Nobel recipients has increased. Even so, a recent study in 2019 showed, it's a statistical study, showed strong evidence of bias toward males in the distribution of Nobel Prizes. So while women have come a long way to being recognized for their skills and abilities that are truly relevant to science, gender disparity is evidence of the persisting patriarchy. But experience and other evidence does indicate that science is trending towards greater gender parity, that is, equal opportunity for men and women. While many women do still face bias and discrimination, these issues remain far more problematic for women scientists of color. This is a persisting problem that deserves and does receive focused attention in the literature and by organizations that appreciate the value of a diversified workforce. So in the day-to-day life of science today, women's experience in the ongoing patriarchy does continue to vary. And while most institutions think of themselves as equitable, their workforce numbers really don't support that. As I described before, there are many career types within science, but today I'll focus on the academic research ecosystem, because most professional scientists have their start within this ecosystem, at least through the advanced training stages. And many who do leave the laboratory often go into funding administration or the publishing business, and so they remain part of the ecosystem. The academic career path includes several stages from postdoctoral up through tenured professorship, and advancement along this path requires a continued demonstration of merit and productivity in order to survive, not to mention succeed. And this plays out in an iterative path of competing for funding and for publishing your research. And these challenges can be exacerbated for women by some patriarchal factors. Now, the means for assessing the science is peer review, which is used to assure that the science and the scientific results are trustworthy and based on sound and rigorous approaches. Toward fair and objective evaluation, funding agencies and journals strive for diverse and balanced representation on peer review panels with respect to gender and other demographic characteristics such as race and ethnicity. And hopefully, in most cases, we've come a long way from the white male-dominated peer reviews of last century. Nowadays, funding agencies and other organizations recognize the value and importance of diversity on such panels. Diversity increases perspective and creative thought and reduces bias. Requirements for these values, diversity, equity, and inclusion, are now codified in the guidelines, policies, and procedures of most organizations that convene panels, and NIH and NSF are particularly notable for their rigorous practices in this area. Importantly, though, because the population remains low for women in some of the physical sciences and women scientists of color, the burden falls on the few to represent their demographic by serving repeatedly and disproportionately often on panels for the sake of diversity. Like those who paved the path for us, the spotlight is on them as they set a higher standard and further the path for still underrepresented groups. The pipeline of girls interested in science who proceed on to a career in science to be professional researchers is called leaky. While 40% of PhD recipients are female, at the highest leadership positions, only 5 to 20% are represented by women. While women do pursue scientific careers, they don't achieve the highest levels of leadership at the same pace as men do, and the numbers decrease as the level of career stage increases. They often don't stay in the science, and thereby reducing the pool for potential leaders. There are a number of obstacles that contribute to this phenomenon, and just a few are noted here. Support and mentoring is so important, especially at the early stages. And in an early career, parenthood often draws women away from the career, at least for a time. And the knowledge that there is gender bias in the evaluation of research results is discouraging. Women report feeling a lack of influence and lower access to employment opportunities. And the culture of science traditionally is individualistic, so this can lead to a feeling of isolation and exclusion, which can be discouraging as well. But there are also factors that clearly support women in science and continuing along this pathway, which include examples of women in leadership. This phenomenon of I gotta see what I can be is real. To have role models and mentors and encouragers. Mentoring, of course, is important, as is transparency and recruitment. And women need to be part of the decision-making process. An awareness by institutions that there are gender inequalities is helpful too, and especially if they're putting in places practices to try to address this. Promoting collaboration and pay equity, of course, is very important as well. And these are things that promote and encourage women along the path. Gender bias is a generic and prevalent phenomenon that's apparent in the current science ecosystem in many and varied ways, and it can impede the path for women scientists. Everyone harbors biases ingrained in us by society, many of which we're not even aware of. These are so-called implicit biases. And it requires proactive intentionality on our part to reflect and recognize those implicit biases and change them both gender and other kinds of biases as well. Many organizations actually now provide implicit bias awareness training for their scientists and managers. And I've actually witnessed this awareness in the active research community on peer review panels that I have convened, where the reviewers comment critically on the extent to which there is diversity on the scientific team that they're reviewing. And if there isn't sufficient diversity, that they want to see that they're at least working towards that. So that is a value within the community. There are many settings in which gender bias is apparent in science, and I'll touch on 3 areas where we see it played out in the academic system. The competitive years leading to a professional tenure can coincide with the typical childbearing and child-rearing ages. And leaving the workforce at this stage can result in loss of the competitive edge, which can be very difficult to be regained. Some find the competing priorities of intensive research with parenthood to be incompatible because many areas of science just don't adhere to a schedule, much as babies can't. So women traditionally experience this more intensely as they obviously own the lead role in childbearing, and they often take on the lead role in child rearing as well. But these traditional roles, in recent decades, of course, we've seen husbands and partners more commonly and equitably sharing in that leading intensive parenting role. In an equitable environment, being a scientist can actually be very conducive to raising kids. Depending on the field and the lab or office culture, some scientists can have flexible hours. On-site lactation rooms and child care centers certainly helped alleviate some of the competing pressures of research and parenting. Supportive networks and environments within your lab and office, though, in combination with that family support, really seem key to giving women the best chance for success in both roles. One author, Amanda Zellmer, who's both an ecologist and an author, shared that she found that being a parent actually improved her ability as a scientist, as it required her to plan her experiments more carefully. And ultimately, as her daughter grew, her daughter became her favorite research assistant. For scientists who do choose to take time away from their careers for family responsibilities, NIH offers a special career reentry grant. And some of the early career NIH grants actually now allow for cost reimbursement for child care, parental leave, and even additional technical support. Although the United States lags behind many other countries in paid maternity and paternity leave, the demand for these benefits are gaining momentum. And you may have heard that in October of this year, federal workers will be allowed up to 12 weeks of paid parental leave for the first time in American history. Maybe this will be a trend that other organizations follow. Sexual harassment is perhaps the most egregious manifestation of patriarchy, and one that we see in the headlines of broader society on a daily basis. And it's being openly addressed, fortunately, now advancing the evolution of patriarchy towards a more equitable culture. In recent years, within the science ecosystem as well, sexual harassment is being acknowledged. The National Academy of Science in 2018 conducted a study that confirmed and characterized harassment in science, and this has informed codes of conduct and training modules that have been written and are being disseminated to all the organizations within the science ecosystem. Hopefully, this will lead to fewer incidences of harassment and also increased ways of addressing it. Another area of science where gender parity is important is the world of medical research and medicine. This is important not just for social justice, but for scientific validity. For many years, women in research were treated as a variation of men. But now, of course, there are well-documented differences in the metabolism and physiological states between males and females that can impact the way that some diseases present and progress. A person's sex can significantly affect the course and severity of common diseases. And so it's important that there be proportionate numbers of female subjects in research studies and clinical trials. This is important for drug trials, too, as side effects disproportionately affect females. Again, even more underrepresented than women, however, are the specific health concerns of women and men of color in both research and clinical studies. In contrast to some women colleagues who have been harassed and had opportunities withheld, I fortunately have been subject to minimal harassment, and I perceive that what gender bias I have experienced has not had a negative impact on my career. I clearly benefited from Title IX, the civil rights law to bring equality in education that was passed in 1972 when I was just entering the 7th grade. By the early 1990s, when I was in the early career stage that's so vulnerable to dropout, the scientific community already was starting to realize and appreciate the value of diversity, gender as well as other demographics. My scientific career path had largely been paved by intelligent, courageous, and strategic women who both endured and pushed back against sexism of all forms. Indeed, I came along at a time when I believe in some circumstances I actually benefited from my gender. In unofficial conduct similar to affirmative action, I believe females, that is white females, at that time actually began having an advantage over white males, at least for a while. Being female was not always seen as a liability, and in fact, giving us opportunities may have elevated an organization's reputation. Sometimes, maybe opportunity came because I was a female rather than in spite of it. But I also recognize myself as a member of the patriarchy. And at times, I have probably unknowingly contributed to its persistence. There were times when I remained on the sidelines when witnessing bias rather than speaking up, or laughed at sexist jokes. I have sidestepped inappropriate advances from male colleagues rather than confronting them. Awareness of my prejudices and implicit biases has been part of my own evolution and growth. Our implicit biases are implanted at a tender age, and in my experience and those shared by some women colleagues, is that perceptions of our own gender-based limitations related to STEM came long before we ever could have considered a career choice. In the unspoken messages in kindergartens of the 1960s that girls don't play with blocks, or in the high schools of the 1970s that while girls can be on the math team, they're not really welcome. These are just two seemingly benign examples of unspoken, accepted cultural norms. But with each self-examining generation, such messages to girls are lessening, and girls are now actively invited and encouraged into STEM. How society supports those who enter STEM is key to keeping them engaged. Evolution is a slow and gradual process, usually with incremental advancement. But I believe that what we see today seems no longer incremental, but transformational. With girls entering STEM, cultural changes in the science ecosystem that support them throughout the pipeline, women speaking up to their harassers, and in many cases, male colleagues speaking up on women's behalf and even asking if and how they are manifesting their own behaviors and correcting them. While there is work to be done, no doubt, I personally am optimistic about the state of patriarchy in science. With active engagement in the community and on the part of organizations, I believe that science is evolving into an equitable and welcoming place for scientists of all genders, races, and ethnicities. Thank you.
I want to remind you, as you have any questions, please write them on your cards, or if you're out there in the ether, if you could send them in. There is an email address somewhere or some kind of an address. But send in your questions. Oh yeah, here's the email. evolutionweekendmd evolutionweekendmd@gmail.com. Everybody got that? evolutionweekendmd@gmail.com. Moving on, we're moving from science to what precedes science, which is education. Something we all go through, right? Whether we're scientists or something else. Dr. Caryn McTighe Musil will be speaking with us on patriarchy in education. Formerly, she was teaching in English and women's studies and now has moved on to be the Senior Director, I like this title, Senior Director for Civic Learning and Democracy Initiatives at the Association of American Colleges and Universities. That sounds like a government title, you know? It's so wonderfully long. Raised an Episcopalian, she saw the light when she attended Germantown, UMC, outside of Philadelphia, and is now active in Westmoreland Congregational UCC. So, Caryn?
Aside from the fact I don't like to drink out of plastic if I can avoid it, I thought I would bring my Votes for Women Equality is the Sacred Law of Humanity, which was bought, I believe, in one of the archives, one of the exhibits that's down in DC. So it's wonderful to be here. Maynard is clicking his finger to tell me to, whoops, that's the wrong way. Okay. That's okay. That's okay. That's fine. It's wonderful to be here, to be part of a panel that's exploring patriarchy and ways in which it permeates and shapes our consciousness, whether we're male or female. This is not something that only happens if you're male. I appreciated in particular that Amy referred to, feeling as if she was part of the patriarchy and participated in it. I wanted to also, explain a little bit about why I chose the title that I did. I am now doing a lot of work around democracy. My former title at AAC&U was even more grandiose. It was the Senior Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Global Initiatives. So it is a place that allows you to simply, make up the things that you really want to work on and then try your best to raise money so you can do that. I'm really focused on the part of the real estate that actually I think Amy ended up talking about a little bit, higher education, because that's where scientists are trained, but where patriarchy took root, where it ruled, and where it needed to be rescued from itself, certainly by women, but also by many other people who had been shut out, and by people who understood that by reducing the number of minds thinking about an issue, you would diminish the potential of the academy to actually advance knowledge, and advance knowledge in a way that would benefit society, and particularly a diverse democracy like ours. I think it's a little bit difficult in today's world to quite remember the centuries of exclusion that women across colors and classes and religions faced, because today the majority of undergraduates are female, and the majority of graduates in master's programs, and the majority of some doctoral programs are women. People in it are women. But numbers alone have never made the difference. There were many more slaves in Williamsburg than there were white people. And that didn't end up meaning that slaves had the power. But from the inception, and this is something, I'm reading a very fascinating book called The Chocolate City, The Story of Race and Democracy in America's Capital. And it goes back to the origin, why democracy has been so intertwined with the notion of slavery and of race since its very inception. This is also true of higher education, of colleges and universities. And they, of course, reflected the world they were in. So the earliest colleges and universities, before we were a nation, when we were just colonies, whether it was Harvard, William and Mary, or Yale, women were shut out, and so were almost every possible kind of man you could imagine, across colors and across classes. So they were continued, they were designed to create the leaders for this new imagined city on the hill, this new country that eventually became a republic. But they wired it so that the only people who could go there to become those leaders would have been white men. So one of the things about patriarchy to remember, it is people, but it is more systems, structures, architectures, policies, so the people can change. And the people can become looking like the people that might have been shut out or oppressed. But the structure of valuing some people less than others is the same. And it is a very difficult thing to have to undo. And it's taken us a very long time to even begin to make some strides in that work. It wasn't until 1833 that Oberlin College became the first place in the entire United States that would educate men and women at the same time. And that would, at that same time in 1883, educate white and black at the same time. And it remained the only one for a very, very long time. You began to have, and this is how people change things, you began to have the world shift and women get more access to the opportunity to learn when they began founding their own colleges. Sometimes you have to organize yourself to create the world you want that gives you what you need. And I think women and other people who've been shut out have been doing that kind of work for a very, very long time. So you had at the sort of beginning in the 1830s and flourishing in the 70s and 80s, this explosion in the number of women's colleges, both religious and secular, in the United States. And with the Morrill Act in the I think it was 1867, where there was a public land grant school in every single state, you began to have higher education open to more people, farmers, imagine, and among those, women began to have access to some public education as well. After the Civil War, you had the establishment of historically black colleges and universities, which began to educate men and women of African descent in new ways. So as higher education sought to guard its gate and lock most people out, eventually they began to realize that that wouldn't gain them the excellence that they so prized. And as W.E.B. Du Bois put it, of all the civil rights for which the world has struggled and fought for 5,000 years, the right to learn is undoubtedly the most fundamental. This is W.E.B. Du Bois. But by the 1940s, pardon? I'm not ready to, thank you. Yeah. Thank you. But by the 1940s, only 5% of Americans had college degrees. So most of what I will talk about is what really occurred after the war, and the kind of big policy change and the big expansion of higher education, and who could actually now go. When my father was born, in 1902, only, I think, 3% of Americans went to college. By the time his grandchildren went to college in the 90s, 77% of students who graduated from high school, you had to get that far, went on to some kind of college. They didn't all graduate. But you had an enormous century of democratizing higher education that really began seriously with once World War II was over and the GI Bill and other things happened, but that began to really open up and to begin to pull in more perspectives, experiences, talents that could be tapped to pull all the knowledge and to address the most vexing and dangerous challenges that face people and planet. But what allowed colleges and universities to be entrapped in a system that only permitted a very few men and their minds to be deemed sufficient, let alone excellent? And the answer reveals why it's so important to develop an explanatory theory and to test those. I never even heard the term patriarchy. How many of you, maybe I'm old, so until I was teaching at LaSalle College in Philadelphia as a young English professor who was in the midst of writing a women's studies dissertation before women's studies had been established as a field of inquiry. So I'm in that first wave of women's studies, kind of discovering things. And before that, I didn't have an explanation to even inform me why I was experiencing certain inequalities, if I even noticed them. My husband and I are now bird watchers. We've seen hundreds of birds, can identify birds. We took a trip out west in 1970, camping along the way. We did not see a single bird. We had no frame for recognizing them if they were there and distinguishing between them. Now, of course, I see them everywhere. I can't walk without seeing them. This is what knowledge does. This is what new frames and new lenses. And I will be making an argument that having a gender lens that, as Amy said, intersects with race and class and religion and ethnicity, that kind of lens allows us to see things that otherwise would be invisible. And I think the most pernicious things about patriarchy is how invisible it is. It really isn't a group of men screaming, "I hate women," although I'll give you a few people who do that. But it is a system that presumes that is the case, that then justifies everything it does, not in the name of inferiority, but in the name of it's just not good enough, or I wouldn't want to give a fellowship to Jane because she's just going to get married, whereas John will, go on and not drop out of graduate school. So I think one of the first things I ended up realizing when I began to understand patriarchy and learn about it was that most of it is the inferiority of women is man-made. Would you believe it? This is a quote from Helen Keller, who was an amazing person anyway, but I never knew what a strong, progressive woman she was on a lot of issues. So, and it is one of the things, and I will constantly be talking about ways in which white supremacy functions in this same way, and when Amy talked about the isms, it are these hierarchy of values that someone makes up, and then everyone believes. Do we have anyone around doing that right now? Kind of promulgating lots of things that have no basis in fact, but if you say them long enough, people will believe the earth is flat. Or that science isn't real and isn't worth, understanding. So I really want to, and patriarchy feels absolutely invincible and all-powerful, and it is, ultimately without too much self-reflection. It's one of my favorite little cartoons. A group of men deciding whether they should grant women equality. This is why many people who are shut out or tamped down just get angry and organize and don't wait to be given the vote, given the freedom. They just begin to organize to make that difference. And if these notions of women's inferiority were common, even in a boardroom like that, which is all too common in corporate boardrooms, we have plenty of reasons historically where this is just reinforced. This is Aristotle. Not a bit ashamed to say this. And all of us study Aristotle as if he is the foundation of thinking, and he has many good ideas. This is not one of them. So what you want to do, is to figure out and know when the system of knowledge is absolutely fundamentally false, not based on any realities and not any values. Darwin, followed in suit. I was actually shocked to see this. Darwin at one point said, "I certainly think that women, though superior to men in moral qualities, are inferior." And other scientists agreed, like Harvard-educated Edward Clark. I want you to notice where they're educated. Trained at Penn Medical School, I'm a Philadelphian, who at the height of women beginning to have access to education in the 1880s, wrote a tiny little book called Sex in Education, in which he argued that the intellectual demands on girls and women, this is really frightening, would threaten their reproductive health. And studying could divert a girl's limited blood supply away from vital organs. Exactly. We should laugh. They did not all laugh then. A lot of the women, especially being educated then, were furious at him. This was a highly respected man or scientist. And so while we are really talking about the kind of conversation religion and science can have, we do need to acknowledge when both of those entities have been forces of oppression, forces of subjugation, forces of falsehood, forces of self-aggrandizing who's ever in power in those worlds, in their spot. William Sedgwick, a Yale-educated, and then Harvard, before teaching at MIT, and if any of you are in public health, he is sort of one of the founders of public health. But he agreed with Clark and said women could become infertile if they did too much studying. And you wonder why some women worry when they go to college that they won't get married. I mean, I don't think we worry that our mammary glands will shrink, as some people said they might, but there is some way in which somehow this is unnatural. And with the Aristotle, it was the unnatural, natural order of things that he did. Sedgwick, slid out of the biological world. He's an epidemiologist, and where he had some authority. Then talk about the women's vote. This is in the height of, it was such a long struggle, but this is in one of the periods of struggle for the suffrage women. And he believed that women's suffrage and feminism would degenerate and degrade the human fiber, setting it back 1,000 years. Now, again, this is a man who is a prominent epidemiologist, bacteriologist, founder of public health, served as president of many scientific and professional associations, and once in a while had a female student in his class. So imagine how far the mind would have to shift to be ready for the dynamite young women that are in today's classes. In case you believe such notions of women's inferiority have disappeared in a comparative study of male and female resumes, I remember them doing this in the 70s, they did it again in 2012, with 100 scientists. And they were asked to evaluate resumes that were exactly the same, the only difference were the name would be changed. Resumes with women's names were rated significantly lower in competence and hireability. And the evaluators were less willing to consider mentoring these women. And most troubling of all, of course, is the results were the same whether the evaluating scientist was male or female. So this is why it's really hard work to be constantly alert on ways in which these vile ideas could seep into our consciousness, and do, and why it is so important to be woke, to be alert, to understand, to ask questions, to look again. And the world and this is, fortunately, we have, I would say, the real force has been from women. You can find some male allies along the way, but it is the women scholars who go into the scientific fields and challenge it and say, this is the research, this is the story about male science. In religion, of course, we have, and this is my particular tradition, a Christian religion, again, the female, it's interestingly, because she wants knowledge, is somehow very dangerous and makes Adam eat it. And therefore, she is expelled. This view of this narrowing and oppressive view of religion is what made Jimmy Carter ultimately leave the Southern Baptists, which was very, very difficult. And he said religion is one of the basic causes of the violation of women's rights. This was hard. He was raised in that. He loved that. He didn't leave religion, but he became a person who understood some ways in which it could be problematic. So what are some of the things that ended up liberating higher education? This is a small book that I did a while ago for AAC&U when we had a women's office there, which was trying to mark some of the differences. I think that it certainly mattered that women themselves, as young faculty members, we got together. We created women's studies. We created a new field of inquiry. We created journals. We created organizations. We created awards. We created books. We created archives. We worked. We helped each other on campuses. We filed lawsuits. We did all sorts of things. But we were also in a period. It's not just what we do inside; it's what happens outside. And I want to give you just a few things from the '60s till today, and I want to see how am I doing on time. In 1964, you had the Civil Rights Act prohibiting employment discrimination by race and sex was introduced, to much laughter, to that legislation, but it passed and made all the difference. A year later, the Immigration and Nationality Act that abolishes immigration quotas, which meant you legitimized a whole group of undocumented immigrants, and you opened the doors for more than Europeans to come to the United States, which helped shift the color, character, and countries from which our current citizens are from. In '67, President LBJ did an executive order including women in affirmative action. Then you had the Women's Equity Action League filing the first sex discrimination in 1970 in academia. It was also the same year the first Women's Studies program was founded. Ms. Magazine comes soon, Equity Pay, Title IX in 1972. The UN, we began to have these global forces that influence people's thinking and the culture in which we did our thinking and our learning, declared an International Women's Year, and then they began to do the Decade of Women, which brought women from all over the world together. That's a dangerous thing to do. And it was dangerous to bring us all to Mexico. It was the beginning of a global women. It was not the beginning. It helped seed a global women's movement, which meant we began to compare what's it like for you, what's it like for me, how do we understand how patriarchy or oppression works in your country. I wanted to just add one more. NSF in 1993 begins operating its program on women and girls, funding projects designed to increase women's access. Things don't just happen. Trends don't just trend. You and I and a whole lot of people make them through laws and courts and organizing and policy and structures. And you began then to have some things shift. Sorry, I got the wrong way. One of the important things for those of you who saw Hidden Figures, this is actually Janelle Monáe, who's playing Mary Jackson. And if you remember what she had to do in that scene, she is already a college graduate, a stunning mathematician. I think she was a physics graduate as well. And she's working on, this race with the Russians. And the engineer she's working under says, "You're a brilliant engineer, you should get the professional training." She has to go to court to be able to get permission to walk into that class as the only woman and the only person of color. She does it, and it's because people came in through the doors, sometimes through their own gumption and defiance, but also through the opening up of access, through some of these legislations, through some colleges realizing if they don't produce more scientists, we aren't going to have enough. That was really one of the big motivations for NSF. It wasn't, gee, we've been unfair. Colleges were the same way. Diversity is working that way today for many of them. So one of the things that had to happen was not just to let women in, but to say the broad range of people that could come, look at what they study, not just the discipline, but how are they studying biology? What questions are they posing? What writers are they reading? What history are they learning that they didn't know before that tell them the whole human story? Who's teaching them? Who's leading their college? I mean, you have to look at all these pieces of the patriarchal setup to begin to get a different set of voices and perspectives and windows cleaned and opened so you can see out them for the first time. So we have really worked very hard, I think, to make progress in all those areas, but it isn't, of course, totally sufficient. You know, there are still these inequalities. One of my other favorite ones is if you've been in these fancy hotels, realizing that the person next to you got to the top floor really quickly because you didn't know they were in the express elevator. And you happened to climb on one invisibly that went, nyeh, nyeh, nyeh. And it took you forever to get up there. So what are the systems that all little pieces create these and repeat these inequalities? I want to, and I'll just, reiterate that we still are facing, even with women as 50% of the faculty, are still not earning what men earned and haven't seemed to make much a difference. In terms of families, one of the depressing things I never told my daughters as they were having children in their professional lives, how much of a difference babies matter for women, and one of them became a professor. Babies are an advantage for men in academia, and they're a disadvantage for women. I wasn't surprised at the latter, I was surprised at the former. You can do something about that, but if you've got something geared so that you won't recognize that's going to be a normal part, then you will doom them to not having as much not having as much opportunity. Let me end with 3 things that you can do, because I'm aware I'm rooted in academia, I'm rooted in a network, I'm rooted in a higher ed association, and most people in this room are not. And so I began to think, one of the things I would want to say is how important it is for everybody, male and female, at all ages. I talk a lot to my grandsons and my granddaughters, so that they can see how things work, to develop a gender lens, so you can notice when things are funny. And to use that as a way to analyze, and to use your power to instill that as a bottom line foundational piece for a diverse democracy. I think it has to intersect with other lenses of race, class, ability, sexuality, religion, ethnicity. So it means that you keep reading, talking, moving, seeing movies, learning with others at every educational level. It's a tool for understanding the destructive power of patriarchy and for having tools to dismantle it. The second one comes from Ida B. Wells, a wonderful, impressive, amazing, brave, defiant woman who not single-handedly but put an end to lynching of black men, in which they were lynched every 4 days in our country. And she did many other things, but she said eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And so it's important, even though people mock feminists for bean counting, keep counting. How many? Who's not there? Which ones are coming in and not coming in? Who's moving up those ladders? Who has rungs they can even climb on? Collaborate across differences, seek unlikely allies, give money to groups that work for gender equity and gender justice. Be sure that the last victory over inequality hasn't been undone and surfaces. And I will say, I'm of the generation that grew up, my children grew up with Free to Be You and Me, liberation from Dick and Jane. I now have kids that are smothered in pink and princesses. Someone recently wrote a book, Who Stole My Daughter? So the sort of constriction of those male and female boys and girls roles have their own insidious things. And then the last thing I would say is be attentive to, champion, organize alongside those who are still excluded, invisible when they actually are there, malnourished both physically and intellectually and spiritually, marginalized, denied opportunities to use their talents. So wherever you are, whatever you're doing, you have power. So use that to expand the power of others. That might be for higher ed, be a mentor, fund a scholarship, hire a summer intern from a first-generation student. Use your power as an alum. Many of you are college graduates. Ask how they're doing with equity on a multiple levels. And I would just end, by all means, do be sure to vote with an informed sensibility about inequality in 2020. And then at that point, we may be able to have more pictures like this when we are really tapping and bringing and educating and being educated by a whole new generation of women across classes and colors who will really help us bring the kind of world we all should be longing for. Thank you.
Wow, I keep thinking of all these comments I want to make, but that's not my job, so. I remind you, if you have questions, please write them out, and if you're out there in Etherland, evolutionweekendmd@gmail.com, send them in. Our final.
If you're using the cards, please, if you have a question, use the card and print if you can. And raise your hand.
And if you haven't taken engineering or architectural drawing, we prefer that form of printing, but if you haven't taken that, we'll take what you learned in whatever grade it was. But yes, printing is easier to read. Our final panelist today is Dr. Carla Works, who is going to be talking about patriarchy in the church. I think it's not accidental that her specialty area is St. Paul, who is one that some of us in seminary had a few problems with. But she is a full professor at Wesley Theological Seminary, teaches in New Testament, just a really cool person, and, well, she went to Yale. So I guess they were letting women in by then. Not only that, you went to Yale Divinity School, so that's really impressive. And then also Princeton. So she got those. She knocked them both out of the park. Written a lot of books. I know students who've had her as a teacher and say she's just about the best thing out there. So passionate about teaching, serving in the church. Carla, you're on.
Thank you, Joy. I don't know if I can live up to that introduction, but thank you very much. And thank you to the board for the invitation to be here. I appreciate it. Let me see if I can work this. Excellent. I went the right way in everything. When I talk about patriarchy and the church, I'm talking about ways of thinking that have privileged men, not only in positions of leadership in the church, but also in ways in which the church has taught us so-called biblical family values, with the husband being the head of the household. Historically and traditionally, the church has limited the roles in which women can serve. Although more and more churches are acknowledging women in leadership positions, we still have a very long way to go to break that cathedral glass ceiling. Rather than talking generally about the ways that patriarchy still has a stronghold in the church, I would like to use my time to talk specifically about a few biblical passages that have been used to maintain patriarchy. In other words, I would like to confront the church's patriarchy at one of its foundations, the Bible. Until we reassess our reading of the Bible, we will continue to reinforce the patriarchal cultures of the biblical world without asking whether being faithful to the gospel requires us to live under such a hierarchy. I will focus my remarks around a few key passages from Paul's letters related to patriarchy in the household and patriarchy in church leadership. But first, I want to say a brief word about Genesis. To support the superiority of men in the family unit, some turn to Genesis to argue that from the beginning, men are created to be leaders over women. They cite Genesis 2:18, that the woman is created to be a man's helper. By this translation, they imply that the helper is subordinate, even though the same word, the same Hebrew term, gets used throughout Genesis and does not elsewhere imply subordination. But they support their reading by noting that men are created first. Women come from men, and so men are superior. Basing superiority on being first is a shaky argument in a biblical narrative where Jacob gets blessed over Esau and where John the Baptist precedes Jesus. Not to mention the fact that we have another creation account where animals are created before humanity. Nonetheless, the argument of primacy is found even within the biblical corpus in 1 Timothy, a letter to which we'll turn later. In fact, many who hold patriarchal views of the Bible turn to the Pauline epistles for support. Those who hold what have been called traditional biblical values, especially for the family, have taken as the model the household codes in Ephesians 5. The text in Ephesians 5 gives instructions to each pair of units within a household: husbands and wives, masters and slaves, parents and children. Now, instructions such as these are common in the Greco-Roman world. In fact, very common in Greco-Roman moral philosophy. Aristotle, for instance, we've already seen a quote from Aristotle today. Aristotle saw the household as the microcosm of society. If the household, which was the basic building block of society, if the household functioned well, then the larger society would be healthy. In other words, everyone should operate within his or her place in the hierarchy. Most of these instructions are geared towards the inferior party in the pair, so telling wives to submit is commonplace. Having codes from the larger culture within the biblical text is not surprising, except that the codes that we see in Ephesians and its parallel in Colossians are a bit odd. Yes, they give instructions to wives, children, and slaves. This is typical. But unlike their cultural counterparts, they give instructions to the husband, master, and parent. In other words, the biblical text has a lot to say to the paterfamilias, the head of the family. And what the text says would have been earth-shattering for the day. Husbands and wives are told to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Husbands are told to love their wives as Christ has loved the church and has given himself up for the church. In other words, sacrificial love. Husbands are told to love their wives as they do their own bodies. Now, I need you to bear in mind that in the first century world, marriage was simply a property exchange arranged between households. No one chose a mate based on love. If the head of the household were to follow the advice found in Ephesians 5, this household of believers would not operate like any household in the known world. It would be a household where the one in power has relinquished his power to love his wife, to honor his children, and to treat his servants with dignity. This text fights the traditional roles of the larger culture, even as various members of the church must live within the very roles that the larger culture has dictated for them. Everyone falls somewhere within the spectrum of the household. And this text attempts to help the believers grapple with those realities and still be faithful, even though following the advice of Ephesians 5 disrupts the hierarchical order and thereby disrupts the status quo. The honor of the household does not come first. Christ does. And Christ's sacrificial love is the model for the paterfamilias. Outsiders are supposed to be able to look at this family unit, this household, and see the love and scandal of the cross. What is interesting, though, is that the church has historically latched on to Ephesians 5 to support the teaching of the submission of women to their husbands, which the text unequivocally supports. Yet the church has virtually ignored that most of the instructions in the passage are geared toward men, or that the instructions given here are actually quite radical for a first century world. Instead, women have been told to submit because the husband is the head of the household. At the extremes of this theology, women have even been told to endure various kinds of abuse. They are told they must submit at any cost, and they are told they should love their abusers, which interestingly, this text never even commands women to love their spouse. To be sure, not all churches who believe in traditional gender roles would agree that women must submit to the point of enduring abuse. Those who call themselves complementarian believe that male and female together make up the image of God, and that male and female in their distinctive gender roles need one another. But still, many churches see in Ephesians 5 the model for marriage, where the husband is the head or the leader, and the wife knows her place as the helper. Recently, with the prominence of the Me Too and the Church Too movements, we have ample examples of how this theology has produced an environment where women are viewed as inferior to men. If the church had used 1 Corinthians 7 as the basis for its instruction on the household, our traditional views of gender roles would be very different. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul hopes that the believers will not marry. If they don't marry, they have more time to go about the work of the gospel. Paul warns them that if they marry, they will be distracted by the concerns of the household. In this passage, marriage is not the ideal, it is a concession. Single women and single men would be the ideal leaders and teachers and missionaries. So then, how do we get so many churches, particularly in the Protestant tradition, that want to have a married male minister? The role of the household and the role of church leadership are linked in a later biblical text. In 1 Timothy, the author says that the bishop should be a one-woman man who can support his household well. Notice 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 5. If someone does not know how to manage his household, how can he take care of God's church? Now, most biblical scholars believe this text must be written later in the life of the early church. It represents a time when the church must create some organization so that it can survive to the next generation. The earliest churches believed Jesus was returning in their lifetime. When apostles and early believers started dying, the church realized that the second coming of Christ might be delayed. So leadership offices began to form. No one is yet calling himself a senior pastor, but there are elders and deacons and overseers and widows whose roles in church leadership are beginning to take shape. Plus, the churches rely on households for their existence. There are no white steepled buildings in the heart of town. The church does not enjoy the legal right of public assembly. So if this early Christian movement is going to survive, it had to operate within the confines of a household, a respectable household. The church could not afford for the household to catch the attention of the authorities, because the message at the heart of this gospel is one that Rome considers insurrection. Jesus is Lord, not Caesar. The instructions given to Timothy in Ephesus must be read in light of this first century context. Unfortunately, though, churches that suffer from a patriarchal gospel have often used this passage as a litmus test for church leadership, meaning a leader should be male, and for many churches and denominations, preferably married, although clearly there are other church traditions that have latched on to 1 Corinthians 7 and prefer their male leaders to be celibate. What would happen, though, if we considered all of the evidence that's in our biblical text? The truth is that limiting leadership offices to men ignores the rest of the biblical evidence. Early in the life of the church, women were not restricted from church leadership, even in Paul's churches. You can see from the slide that there are many women who are active in Paul's churches, but let me highlight a few examples. Phoebe. In the last chapter of Romans, as Paul is about to send his parting greetings, he writes a recommendation for Phoebe, whom he calls a benefactor and a deacon. Phoebe is the one delivering the letter and reading it to the multiple house churches in the city of Rome. Thus, she is Paul's ambassador. As the reader of the letter, she is also this letter's first interpreter. She would have to answer any questions on Paul's behalf. Get this, Paul chose a woman as the first interpreter of a letter that has indelibly shaped our church history. Also in Romans 16, Paul sends greetings to several people, many of whom are women. Prisca is named alongside her husband Aquila as a leader of a house church. Other women are named as especially active in the community: Tryphosa, Tryphena, Rufus's mother, and Julia, to name a few. But there is one woman named here where we can see the ingrained patriarchy of church history most clearly. In Romans 16, verse 7, Paul names Junia as an apostle. Yes, Junia, a female. Since the church came to believe that women could not serve as apostles, the name has been translated in many popular English translations even today as a masculine name, Junius. Eldon Epp has an excellent little volume noting the history of this name change. The church in the first millennia read this name as female. English translations before the mid-1800s read this name as female. There is no evidence to support this translation as a male name. There are no historical, literary, or archaeological records to suggest that Junius was a common masculine name in the first century world. Junia is a very common female name in the ancient world. In essence, this literary sex change of Junia to the masculine form matched the patriarchal theology of the church to limit such a high leadership position as an apostle to men. Paul, however, called a woman named Junia an apostle, the same title Paul has taken upon himself. And he praised her and Andronicus as being among the earliest of the apostles. They may very likely be among the first to proclaim the gospel, in the city of Rome. But I can hear some of you ask, doesn't Paul elsewhere limit leadership offices to men? There are two texts that Francis Taylor Ginch rightly calls clobber text. Text used to silence any female who expresses a call to ministry. These are 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34 and 35, and 1 Timothy 2, 11 through 12. Let me say a brief word about each. And if you're interested, I cover these texts more fully in my book, The Least of These, Paul and the Marginalized. 1 Corinthians 14 tells women, particularly wives, to be silent in the assembly, and if they have any questions, to ask their husbands at home. I can feel the tension in the room rise. Likewise, in 1 Timothy 2, there are instructions that prohibit women from teaching or having authority over men. But I see that you're still sitting here, so thank you. Both of these texts deserve more attention than we can give in this short introduction. Both must be read in their context. Both texts suggest that the women at the heart of this controversy are wives. While this may not mean anything to you, not everyone in the first century world had the legal right to marry. Only citizens had this privilege. Though there is evidence that even some slaves or freed persons lived as couples, their marriages were not recognized by Roman law. Most in Paul's churches would not have been people of privilege. But the people of privilege are the ones who are used to getting their way because that's how society works. I know that was a stretch for some of you to imagine. The instructions in 1 Corinthians are particularly problematic for two reasons. First, these verses appear in two different places in our earliest manuscripts. This suggests that the verses were added as a marginal note by a scribe, probably later in the first century, to make the practices of the churches a little more consistent with the practices at the end of the first century. In other words, these verses were not likely penned by Paul. Second, in another passage in 1 Corinthians 11, verses 2 through 16, women are praying and prophesying in front of the assembly. The issue in that passage is not whether women can pray or prophesy or lead in worship, but it's how they are attired when they do so. So if all women are being silenced in 1 Corinthians 14, it directly contradicts the practices of women praying and prophesying in 1 Corinthians 11, where their leadership is not an issue. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, the author gives more description of these wives. They have braids in their hair. They wear gold jewelry. They have multiple outfits for Sundays. They have free time to go about gossiping because they don't have to work for a living. These women are not your average housewives. In my book, The Least of These, I refer to these women as the real housewives of Ephesus. They are rich, they are privileged, and they have even used some of their wealth to support false teachers who are going around preying on these women, taking their money in exchange for bad theology. Then, whenever the church assembles, these rich women think they know more than the male teachers, because after all, they purchased an education. And they openly correct the male teachers in front of the assembly. And the male teachers, well, they can do nothing about it. Why? Because these women are likely the benefactors of the church. They cannot be corrected. It goes against social etiquette. So who has the authority to correct them? Not young Timothy. So we have to have a letter with Paul named as the sender, Paul, the founder of the church at Ephesus. He is probably the only male associated with this church who has enough social clout to correct these rich female benefactors. Hence, we have the instructions in this letter. In short, we are excluding women from church leadership based on one passage in 1 Corinthians that Paul probably didn't even include in his original letter, and one passage that tries to correct a problem in Ephesus. It makes no sense to take these instructions as a mandate to silence all women in all churches across time, especially when Paul has multiple females in other churches who are actively involved in ministry, including an apostle named Junia. In closing, does the gospel mandate or condone patriarchy? Absolutely not. Paul's gospel tears down patriarchy and all the systems that we have talked about today, all the systems that privilege some at the expense of others. Taking the Bible seriously demands that we make every attempt to learn something about the cultures of the biblical worlds and to weigh all the evidence. The cultures of the Bible are patriarchal cultures. That does not mean that God created men to dominate women. In Galatians 3:28, we have a baptismal formula preserved. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male or female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. I don't think that Paul or any first century person had the capacity to imagine true gender equality. This passage does not erase the distinctiveness of the genders, but imagines those differences as sources of blessing rather than sources of discord and oppression. It takes both male and female and their gifts to be part of the body of Christ. It is time we celebrate what God is doing. As the prophet Joel says, the Spirit of God will be and has been poured out on our sons and our daughters. Amen.
Well, I think that deserves a wow to all three of our speakers today, don't you? You know, one of my privileges, I get to teach a course on John Wesley and Wesleyan movement in America. And so I've studied him a lot. And first of all, you may or may not know that Wesley's best-selling book was a book of science. It was about medicine and nature and things like that. Secondly, Wesley said, if you're going to tell me what the Bible says about something, tell me what the whole Bible says about something. You know, don't pick and choose. And the truth of the matter is most of us pick and choose. So I want to thank all three of our speakers. Tell me what I'm supposed to do now, Maynard.
So everybody come on up.
Everybody come on up here. Sit in front of a microphone.
And you sit on this end.
Oh, I sit on that end?
Yeah.
Well, we've only got 3 mics. We'll share. We're Christians, right? I can start by asking you, do you have any comments among you? Or something that someone else said that struck you?
I'm so struck by us having all the airtime. I'd love, I don't know whether you feel this, to hear what is on some of these.
Okay.
If that's okay, unless you want to say something.
No,
I did have one question, and I'm going to get to theirs in a minute, on this whole issue of implicit bias, because we all have it. Mm-hmm. When you have identified your own personal implicit bias, what can you do about it?
I might mention, first of all, that there are surveys. I know that Harvard has one, and there's probably others as well. There are tests that you can take online, privately, to help you identify what they are. And I think that's the key, is to identify what biases you have. And then I think it's on you to start having conversations and reflecting and thinking, and as Christians praying about how they influence your behavior and how you might change some of those behaviors.
I would just like to add to that. In biblical studies, I think many of my students come to the text and they think that they are objective readers. And so they're always shocked when one of the first things I say to them is that as readers, we all bring baggage to the text. And trying to get them to develop an awareness of that baggage is a real challenge. One of the ways that I do that in my classroom is I present them with other ways of reading through other lenses. And somehow hearing someone reading the text from another lens makes them go, wow, I had never even thought about that. Or I'd never even thought about the fact that I'm reading this text from someone who has, like a healing text. Well, I grew up in a culture with access to medicine. Simple things like that. Sometimes we don't want to be aware of our reading lenses, but in reality, those reading lenses sometimes hinder us from actually reading the text or engaging it. And we can't ever even be critical of our lenses if we refuse to see them. So sometimes deliberate exposure to other cultures, other lenses, other ways of thinking can help stimulate that awareness.
I want to start with this question, which came from one of our online participants. Surely there are instances in which attempts to mitigate patriarchy result in the promotion of truly unqualified persons in their respective fields. The unfortunate results of good but poorly executed intentions have the real potential of damaging future prospects of women in science education in the church. What tools can we utilize to reach the happy medium where gender parity has been achieved without sacrificing quality by means of aggressive affirmative action approach? Who would like to take that one on?
Well, since I didn't comment yet, I'll just tackle this one a little bit. One of the first things to say is that is that lots of mediocre men have been leading, preaching, talking, writing, creating stories, doing bad science. So it's, what I share with that questioner is how do we create common standards that we agree on that we then say, who has these qualities? Yeah. And when you approach it that way, I think implicit in the question, I'm sorry to say, is the assumption that affirmative action means you're going to get lower quality. When affirmative action is the first opportunity we've had in certainly in higher education, to have these brilliant minds that were shut out and the talents tapped. But what you do want is to be very clear about what you're looking for, why you're looking for those things. Why do you need a romantic poet, a person who teaches romantic literature, instead of someone who's doing ethnic, literature? Because you have none of those. And you have a whole new different group of students. So sometimes you have to get beyond the way you used to think excellence was created or defined, and really be very, very open about why do we need what we need and for what purposes. And that is a piece of what will get you to excellence and get you to equity faster. Any
additions or comments on that one? Oh, that was great. I thought that was great. Because, so often we do have this whole idea that affirmative action means we're going to get people who are not qualified. And I'm going to take my advantage. For when I was at NIH, I worked for a while in the Minority Access to Research Careers program. This was not, yes, it was affirmative action, but what it was doing was providing scholarships for minority students who had never had it to go to college, to go to graduate school, to become postdocs. And these were the best of the best of the best. So, yeah, Okay, each one of these is addressed to a single person. So, we won't start with Joy. For Amy, is there any evidence that new STEM programs are bringing more young women into scientific fields? And do they have difficulty securing funding?
I won't be able to answer this with authority and references, but I can say in the reading that I've been doing, there are many programs that are encouraging women and girls into STEM. This is about girls, encouraging girls into
Yes.
STEM?
Mhm.
Yeah, oh, very, very many.
It says young women.
Yeah, okay. And in fact, I learned that February 11th is the International Day of Girls in STEM. There are many programs that do encourage and invite girls into STEM, but I don't know I guess the question is, how successful are they? And I'm sorry, I don't have data on that, but the data is available for that.
Okay, thank you. For Carla, cultural norms evolve slowly. Church norms seem petrified. Wasn't Peter the rock on which the church is founded? If true, the church is in no position. If this is true, does that mean the church is in no position to provide leadership for change? Can you comment on that?
It's pretty terrifying to think that the church has not done a good job, not only in this area, but in many other areas.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I mentioned the Me Too movement and the Church Too movement, which, I think for many churches, perhaps not some of the more progressive United Methodist churches in our area, but churches in the Bible Belt, they were really hit hard by this movement. I grew up in Arkansas, so just to give some context. And it was eye-opening to many in the church that the church had not been a safe haven for women who had experienced abuse and harassment. And we talked about developing an awareness. I think part of the problem is the church has often turned a blind eye to its own problems of how it's created hierarchies of leadership and protected leaders at any cost. It's time we repent, and we have to lead the change. It is shameful that the church is so far behind and has a reputation for being petrified. It is time that the church actually becomes a safe haven. It's time that the church actually becomes a place where we aren't protecting the various isms that are present in our culture, but that we are leading the charge. And if we want more young people to come back to our churches, we have to do this.
That'll preach. Caryn, this is for you. How can patriarchy be diminished as long as hierarchy prevails as an inherent component of higher education?
That is a really, really good question. Because and when we were working on a diversity project, we confronted the fact that it was connected to democracy, and we thought this isn't a very democratic space. But I think that what institutions are at this current moment leaning toward, at least in their mission statements and in their public presentation of themselves overwhelmingly, is how do we become an inclusive, welcoming environment in which the students who come and the people who work there can flourish intellectually, personally, and how to do that has required a sort of rethinking of how we do what we do. So we have shared governance. It used to be the president decides. We have student-centered learning. It used to be the professor that says everything. We used to be self-enclosed, and we now have wonderful transformative partnerships with communities and agencies to work together across academic and non-academic bonds where students do research and get credit and produce. They build things with community groups, so that it has really made us a less hierarchical place than we were before. But it won't be easy.
And I think, to add to that hierarchy is petrified, in the sense, the hierarchy is those who've been in the system the longest get to keep moving up, and those will be the ones that were there first, with the most opportunities in the beginning. Yeah. This one is for who's this for? This is for Amy. Yeah. I was in federal government contracting environment, and I felt that it helped my advancement because of the strong emphasis on affirmative action. It appears that you were also mostly in federal environment. Do you have insight into whether women in private employment experience similar levels of opportunity?
Yeah, this is a good question, because the culture and environment is very different in private industry compared to the academic. And one thing I can share is that women, there seems to be parity across all the positions except the very highest positions in the private industry. So there seems, so there isn't quite the drop-off along the pipeline that you see in academia, but there's a big gap between middle management and higher management. I might just say also regarding the hierarchy, I learned recently too that at NIH they're starting to put in term limits for lab chiefs, I believe, sort of middle management, so that the opportunity for people to compete for those positions, including women, are opening up. So just having opportunities available that anybody can compete for is an important piece of this, of breaking the hierarchy.
Breaking the stone.
The stone, yeah.
Getting the pickaxes on the stones. Yeah. This last question is for me. Science education, the church. In which one was the patriarchy most entrenched? Oh my goodness, let's see, my pension comes from. First of all, I'm older than most of the people up here, but I graduated college in '69. I started graduate school in '72, finished in '77. Was a postdoc at NIH till '81, went to the university medical school, and then came to NIH in '86. So I was at a time of transition. In graduate school, in the Department of Immunology and Medical Microbiology, where I was, we had 0 women faculty. One came while I was there. I worked in a lab of a husband and wife, but she was in a different department because of nepotism rules. They couldn't be in the same department. We had 2 women in our entering class, so it was pretty strong there. I went to NIH as a postdoc. Not a single lab chief in our branch was a woman. They were all men. The vast majority of the postdocs were men. There were a few of us, and we became really good friends. Almost all of the lab techs were women. When I went to the medical school, I was one of 2 women in my department, Department of Microbiology. In the basic sciences in the medical school, which is where I was, we probably had a half a dozen women, some of whom were tenured. In the clinical sciences, almost all of the women faculty were clinical associate faculty, which is a non-tenure track field. When I came to NIH, I had a completely different environment because I went to work at one of the very few institutes that had a woman as a director. Reverend, we bowed down to her a lot. Dr. Ruth Kirstein, who made opportunities for everybody. And our institute was accused of having only women in positions of authority. And I did a count one time, and we had exactly 50% of our positions of authority were held by women. Since the rest of the NIH, that was 10%, it looked like women ran NIGMS. When I came into ministry, I came in at a better time. I have had people leave my church when I was the first pastor. I have had people say, we really wanted a man. But I learned in graduate school, I was about to say something that preachers aren't supposed to say, but I learned in graduate school not to put up with that stuff, and I just didn't. So it's very hard for me to say because the times were a-changing as I was coming through. And I had some very, very difficult issues in the church, mostly not from church members, but from people in authority in the conference, and senior pastors who were older and more set in their ways. I still occasionally get women cannot speak over us, but you know what? I now teach pastors to be, so they'll just have to get over it. So there's not a good answer to that because the times changed so much over the course of my life. But I've run into it everywhere. But I have also run into highly supportive male colleagues and male superiors and male directors. So anyway, I want to thank all of you. Oh yeah, and when I went to seminary, we had 3 tenured women faculty at that time. Now how many are there, Carla? We outnumber the men. Yeah. So, it's changed, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing that we can change in education, in science, in the church, and Lord help us if we don't keep changing. So, thank you all. I think I'm supposed to call on Eleazar for something? No? This is my really good friend, Eleazar Valentin Castaño. Reverend Doctor, all of those things.
Oh. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here and to listen to all these presentations. I was asked to respond and to basically just give a few words about what we heard. I think you have heard more than I can actually, summarize for you. But something that I like to highlight is the fact that, when we talk about the issue of patriarchy in the church and in the life of our society, is clearly not something that we have won over. Amen? It's not something that we have concluded. It's something that continues to be with us. One thing that I have learned as I've been growing from my male chauvinist standing as a man who grew up in an environment where men were the people in charge, and learning that indeed what the Bible calls us to do and to be is actually not something to sustain the idea of patriarchy. Learning that from the Scripture, as I have, it has been a blessing to me then to continue to see how we continue to struggle with the reality of how we live our life in this environment, understanding and honoring women and men who together work to make a difference in the world. I was reminded, of course, from all the presentations, and I was just taken aback by all the wonderful information we received this afternoon. For when we see how patriarchy has been working in our society and Western civilization, it's incredible to think that we actually have been able to move forward. Amen? It's just incredible we have been able to move forward. But I think it's also incredible that we can see that because we also have women as Dr. Musil is his last name, Musil, as she mentioned the fact of how women have had to make their own space, have to create their own spaces in society. And not only have they created their own spaces in the academic world, but they have also created their own spaces in every aspect of life. So that we are actually able to benefit from that reality that of the space that women have carved from the world in which we live, so that we can actually have a different world today. And it's still, right, a world that still have patriarchy, still have the challenges of living in this reality of the patriarchy that still is with us. But it's a space that we have that is new, that is different, because women, and I say women, continue to carve out that new space within the life of our society, within the life of the church, within the life of the academic world and science and seminary, and studying theology. So we have been able to accomplish great things. And I believe that we have been able to accomplish great things because faith has also been, in a larger sense, a guidepost for many women who have been women of faith, who have seen how the scriptures that in many cases have condemned them, as Dr. Works mentioned, how the scripture has been used to subjugate women, how women have taken that same scripture and say that's not how it works, and make a difference. Even though everybody else in the church and in the academic world in the church says, no, this is the way it's supposed to be, women have said, no, that's not how it works, and they have actually given us a different way of looking at life. And for that, we are blessed. We are truly blessed to have this experience of women who have been able to open our eyes and help us to realize the reality of the possibility in God's presence. I was preaching today in my church, and we used the scripture from 1 Corinthians chapter 2. There's many things we could say about that wonderful passage. But something that Paul said in that passage that basically is the thing that I use for my reflection today was that word that Paul tells the Corinthian church. It says, I decided to know nothing among you except Christ and him crucified. And I said to my congregation, this is exactly what it means to follow Jesus. If you know nothing except Christ and him crucified, there is no way that we will be able to sustain patriarchy. Amen? There is no way we are able to sustain any sign of oppression, any way of excluding people. There is no way we can exclude people. There's no way we can set people aside because there is a God that actually says, well, women are subservient to men and so on. Because when we follow Christ, and following Christ by the cross or through the cross, then only love comes into play. And if we are called to love the way of Jesus, then certainly, there is no room for exclusion. There is no room for people to consider that there is somebody who's better than the other. Because when we love like Christ, then we love to the sacrifice. And I think that the women in our church and the women in our society and women around the world have taught us indeed this new way of looking at the world. And I am so glad that I am a man who lives in this time that have been able to benefit from women who have been indeed teachers to me, who have taught me how to be a man in this new age in which we certainly need to do a whole lot more to see real equality for men and women. So thank you, sisters, for your presentations. It's been a real wonderful blessing.
Let's thank all of our panelists.
Amen.
So, as a closing benediction, I simply want to share with you these words that were composed by the International Fellowship of Reconciliation at the end of World War I. God, lead us from death to life, from falsehood to truth. Lead us from despair on to hope, from fear to trust. Lead us from hate to love, from war to peace. Let peace reign in our hearts, in our world, in our universe. Amen. Okay, that ends the session for today. Thank you all for coming, and if you did not fill out the little yellow slip for the door prize drawing. Do so right now.